You ever have one of those moments where you're sitting at a table with your so-called family, and something happens, some offhand comment, a smirk, a look, and it just flips a switch in your brain? Like suddenly, you're not just annoyed anymore. You're calculating. That's where this story starts. My name's Mark. I'm 43, and I used to think that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for myself, especially when it came to family. But one dinner, one stupid, overpriced dinner, changed everything. And now? Well, now I'm done playing nice. Let me back up. I come from one of those families where everything looks normal on the surface. You know, the group Christmas photos, the birthday texts, the obligatory calls on Father's Day. We smile and laugh like everything's fine, but underneath, there's this web of quiet resentment and subtle one-upmanship that never really goes away. My younger brother Ryan, he's the golden child. Always has been. The charming one, the successful one, the one who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. And honestly, for most of our lives, I didn't really mind that much. He was loud, showy, full of himself, but that was just Ryan. I thought I'd learned to live with it. I was the quieter one, the reliable brother. The one who got the hand-me-downs, who stayed behind to help Mom when Dad was sick, who took the late-night calls when Ryan was off in Cancun networking. You get the idea. For the last decade or so, we've lived in different cities. I moved to a modest little suburb outside St. Louis with my son Jacob after my divorce. Ryan stayed in Chicago and got married to Melanie, a woman who, to put it gently, makes passive aggression look like an art form. She's the type who'll smile sweetly while stabbing you with a backhanded compliment so sharp you won't realize you're bleeding until you're halfway home. I've always had a weird feeling about her, like she could smell weakness and enjoyed finding it. But again, I let it slide. For Jacob's sake. For my own sanity. For the sake of keeping the family from imploding. Then came last month. It was my dad's birthday. 72. He's been slowing down a bit. Some mobility issues, memory hiccups here and there, but still sharp enough to crack jokes and laugh at his own stories. Ryan called me a few weeks before and said he wanted to do something special this year. Something upscale, he said. Dad deserves it. He's not going to be around forever. Now, I agreed with the sentiment. What I didn't realize at the time was that something special meant something extravagant, and that Ryan's idea of generosity came with strings so thick you could hang a man with them. We ended up at this steakhouse in Chicago that probably charges you just for breathing their air. The kind of place with leather menus and valet-only parking. I almost didn't go. Between Jacob's school schedule and my work deadlines, it wasn't ideal. But Ryan was insistent. It's just one dinner, he said. Don't overthink it. He even said he'd take care of things, which I assumed meant he'd cover the meal. Dumb, I know. But when someone invites you to a high-end restaurant and says they'll handle it, you assume basic decency, right? Jacob was excited. He's 10, all wide eyes and curiosity, and he doesn't get to see his cousins much. Ryan has 2 kids, Olivia and Mason, both a few years older than Jacob. We drove up the morning of the dinner, checked into a cheap motel outside the city, and I even let Jacob wear his little blazer, the one he insists makes him look like a mini detective. He beamed when I told him he looked sharp. Honestly, that smile made the entire trip feel worth it. Until we got there. We were the last to arrive. Ryan, Melanie, their kids, and my parents were already seated at this massive corner booth, laughing and sipping from those fancy water glasses that look like crystal. I spotted the menus right away, massive slabs of cow on one page, bottles of wine that cost more than my mortgage on the next. My stomach sank, but I told myself not to make a fuss. It was one night. Mark, there you are, Ryan said, standing up to give me that obligatory half hug. He smelled like expensive cologne and ego. Jacob, looking sharp, buddy. He clapped Jacob on the back and ruffled his hair like a sitcom dad. Melanie gave a tight-lipped smile that didn't touch her eyes. She was wearing this beige dress that probably cost more than my entire suitcase. We slid into the booth. Jacob squeezed in next to Olivia and Mason, who were both already glued to their phones, barely acknowledging him. The waiter came by with a polite smile and asked, "Can I start anyone off with drinks?" Ryan didn't even look up. "We already ordered wine," he said, then glanced at me. "Hope you don't mind." I went ahead and got a bottle for the table, which, of course, meant he ordered for himself and Melanie and maybe my dad. No offer for me. No kids' drinks. Nothing for Jacob. "Do you want something, bud?" I asked Jacob quietly. Before he could answer, Melanie chimed in. Oh, we told them we were ready to order as soon as we got here. Hope that's okay. The kids were starving. She turned her smile on me like she was doing me a favor. They've already put in their orders. Wagyu steaks all around. It's their favorite. Jacob blinked. What's Wagyu? It's very fancy steak, Melanie said sweetly. Don't worry, they'll love it. I turned to Ryan. You ordered for everyone? He shrugged, sipping his wine. Well, you guys were late. We're 10 minutes behind. I thought we'd all order together. He waved his hand like I was making a scene. Don't stress. Just order when the waiter comes back. No big deal. And maybe I could have let it go. If that had been the worst of it, I probably would have swallowed my pride, let Jacob order a burger, and chalked it up to Ryan being his usual arrogant self. But then the food started arriving. One by one, massive white plates landed in front of Olivia and Mason, who were still too engrossed in their phones to notice. Perfectly seared steaks, mashed potatoes piped like frosting, little dishes of sauce I couldn't pronounce. My parents got theirs too. Dad looked like he was trying to pretend the plate wasn't making him nervous. And Jacob? My kid. He just sat there, looking around, confused. Ryan caught my eye and gave a lazy smile. We didn't order for you, he said casually. Figured you'd want to pick something for Jacob yourself. Before I could respond, Melanie let out a little laugh. Not a real one. One of those low, fake chuckles that people use when they want you to feel small. You should have packed snacks, she said, dabbing at the corner of her mouth with her napkin. You know how picky kids can be. Jacob looked at me then, really looked. His eyes weren't confused anymore. They were embarrassed, ashamed, like he thought he'd done something wrong by not having a plate like everyone else. And something inside me just snapped. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the table. I just smiled, nodded, and said, good to know. And when the waiter came back around, looking a little frazzled, probably wondering why there was a kid with no plate at a table full of gluttony, I leaned in a little and said, actually, can I talk to you for a moment? That's when things started to change. That's when the entire mood at the table shifted, just slightly, just enough. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Melanie narrowed her eyes. Jacob looked up at me, hopeful. But I wasn't just thinking about Jacob's dinner anymore. I was thinking about every time Ryan had forgotten to pay me back. Every time he made me look small in front of our parents. Every snide remark from Melanie. Every moment I let things slide for the sake of peace. Because this wasn't about steak. It was about respect. And I had a plan. The waiter's name was Luis. Mid-30s, polite to a fault. The kind of guy who probably had to put up with Wall Street types and wannabe influencers on the regular. I could tell he was used to complicated requests and forced smiles. But when I motioned for him to step aside with me for a second, he hesitated like he wasn't sure if he was about to be scolded or tipped. I'm not complaining, I told him quietly, just out of earshot from the table. But I want to order a meal for my son, something good. Not just the cheapest thing on the menu. Whatever the other kids got, but make it medium, not medium rare. And add one of those little dessert things too, if you've got him. Something with chocolate. Luis blinked, nodded, and jotted it down quickly. Of course, sir. I'll rush it. Should I? He tilted his head toward the table, silently asking if I wanted to make a scene. No, I said. Just bring it like it was always part of the plan. He gave a quick, professional smile and vanished toward the kitchen. I turned back to the table to find Melanie staring at me over her wine glass like she was trying to decode a puzzle she didn't like. Ryan was mid-story about some new real estate investment, something about a short-term rental in Palm Springs and how it was basically printing money. Dad was nodding along politely, like he always did when he didn't understand but didn't want to admit it. Mom was already 3 glasses in and playing with the stem of her glass, chiming in every so often with a drawn-out sounds fancy. Jacob was silent, staring down at the empty space in front of him. He kept glancing at Olivia's steak like he wasn't sure if it was okay to look at food he couldn't eat. That did something to me. Not anger, deeper. Like a sadness I'd been carrying in my chest for years had suddenly become too heavy to keep ignoring. 10 minutes later, Luis returned with Jacob's meal. Plated to perfection. Steak cut into slices already, potatoes whipped into a smooth spiral, and a tiny glass cup of chocolate mousse with a gold flake on top. Jacob's eyes lit up. He looked at me like I'd just pulled a rabbit out of a hat. Thanks, Dad, he said, quiet but so genuine I nearly choked on my water. No problem, buddy. Melanie raised an eyebrow. Going all out, huh? I smiled. Figured he deserved the same as everyone else. That was the first crack. The first moment Melanie's mask slipped. But it was Ryan who doubled down. "You sure you can afford this place?" he asked, only half joking. "Didn't realize your job started paying 6 figures. I didn't take the bait. I didn't realize yours stopped." He let out a laugh, too loud and too forced. "Touché. I wasn't trying to be clever. I was just tired. Tired of being the butt of the joke. Tired of watching Jacob get treated like an afterthought. Tired of pretending I couldn't see the difference between how Ryan's kids were treated and how mine was ignored." The rest of the dinner passed in this weird, brittle tension. Dad told a story about some fishing trip from the 80s. Ryan laughed too loud. Melanie checked her phone constantly. Mom made vague, wandering comments about how different things used to be. And I just sat there, chewing slowly, every bite tasting more like drywall, trying to keep my expression calm for Jacob's sake. It wasn't until dessert came that the second crack happened. Ryan pushed his chair back a little and clapped his hands once. Okay, everyone, big surprise time." The kids looked up, interested for the first time all night. Even Jacob perked up. Ryan nodded at Melanie, who reached under the table and pulled out a silver gift bag. "We got Dad something special," Ryan said, handing the bag over. "Thought we'd make this birthday one to remember." Inside was a set of engraved cufflinks, tucked into a leather box. Platinum, with Dad's initials in a fancy script. They shimmered under the restaurant lights. Dad's hands trembled slightly as he picked them up. "Well, I'll be darned," he whispered. These are beautiful." Mom gasped and put a hand over her heart. "Oh, Ryan. Oh, Melanie. This is just so thoughtful." Ryan smiled like a prince. "We wanted to show our appreciation, for everything he's done." Dad looked at me then, just briefly, almost like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. "You didn't have to outdo yourself," Mom said to Ryan, already tearing up. "Mark, isn't this something?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, it is." And then came the third crack. Melanie, ever the tactician, leaned forward and said, "Oh, I almost forgot. We have gifts for the kids too." Jacob's eyes lit up again. I could see the hope bloom in his face. And I think that's what made it hurt the most. Melanie reached into her purse and pulled out 2 small boxes. "Olivia, Mason here." The kids tore into them. Matching gold bracelets. Nothing extravagant, but clearly expensive enough to make a statement. Jacob watched, hands folded in his lap. And that was it. There wasn't a third box. "No. Oh, and this one's for Jacob." "No, we'll get yours later, sweetie." Not even a cheap excuse like, "Oops, we left it in the car." Nothing. Ryan didn't even look at Jacob. Melanie gave him a glance like she didn't notice his confusion at all. My parents? Didn't say a word. And Jacob, he tried so hard to hide it. He looked down, nodded like he understood, and muttered something I couldn't quite hear. "What was that, buddy?" I asked gently. He looked up at me, forcing a smile that broke my heart. "It's okay. I didn't really want anything anyway." And that was it. That was the moment. The breaking point. I didn't say anything at first. I just sat there, watching my son try to act like he wasn't hurt. Watching him mimic my own years of quiet tolerance. And I realized, this was my legacy. This was what I was teaching him. That it was normal to be overlooked. To smile through disrespect. To act like scraps were enough. Not anymore. I took a long sip of my water, set the glass down carefully, and stood up. Ryan looked at me, confused. "You good?" I smiled. "Yep. Just stretching my legs." "Don't go too far," Melanie added with that smirk of hers. "Dessert's coming." I didn't respond. I just walked to the front desk, flagged down Louise, and asked for the manager. When she arrived, a woman named Karen, oddly enough, in her early 50s with that no-nonsense tone seasoned managers always have. I told her exactly what I wanted to do. Quietly, politely. She raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "Absolutely." She nodded once. "We can arrange that." I walked back to the table calm as ever. Sat down like nothing had happened. Picked up my water and waited. 5 minutes later, the check arrived. Not the discreet little black folder you'd expect. No, this was an itemized bill the length of a CVS receipt, printed in bold ink, with everything listed: wines, steaks, appetizers, desserts, and of course, the $120 cufflinks, which Ryan had apparently had delivered to the restaurant in advance. Melanie's face froze. Ryan blinked. Oh, they brought the whole thing. Weird. Usually they just. He picked up the bill. And that's when it happened. He paled. Like actually paled. He started flipping pages. Wait. Why is this? This isn't right. I told them to split it evenly. Luis reappeared like clockwork. Actually, sir, your brother asked us to put everything under his name. Ryan looked up at me, stunned. Wait. What? I smiled, folded my hands on the table, and said nothing. Melanie's voice sharpened. This has to be a mistake. Luis just nodded politely. He confirmed it with the manager. Said it was a family treat. The table went dead silent. Jacob, bless his little heart, just kept eating his mousse like nothing was happening. And me? I just leaned back, smiled at Ryan, and said, good to know. But that wasn't the betrayal. Not yet. No, the real betrayal came 24 hours later. And when it hit, it wasn't just aimed at me. It was aimed at my son. And that was the last straw. The fallout started before I even left the restaurant. As Luis walked away, leaving the check in front of Ryan, my brother flipped through the pages again, muttering numbers under his breath. Melanie reached into her purse, probably more out of habit than intention, but her hand just hovered there as if she was trying to decide whether her ego or her credit limit would take the bigger hit. I didn't wait to see which one won. Jacob had finished his mousse and was pushing the glass cup gently in circles with his fingers, trying to pretend he wasn't aware of the adult tension swirling around him. I leaned over and whispered, "You ready to go, champ?" He looked at me with this curious, quiet relief. Yeah. I didn't even look at the rest of them as I helped Jacob with his coat. I nodded once to my dad, whose face had gone completely unreadable. Mom looked like she wanted to say something, but didn't. Probably too stunned. Or too proud. Or both. We walked out together, me and Jacob, into the cold Chicago night. The wind off the lake was brutal, but I barely felt it. My mind was spinning, not with regret, not even with anger, just calculation. Reflection. I kept hearing Jacob's small voice from earlier in my head. I didn't really want anything anyway. That line haunted me. He didn't say it to be polite. He said it because he meant it. Because he was already learning how to make himself smaller to avoid being disappointed. And I had let him. I had let this pattern repeat across generations. The same way I learned to settle, he was starting to follow suit. I couldn't sleep that night. Not in the stiff motel bed with the sagging mattress. Not with the humming ice machine right outside our door. Jacob was curled up, hugging his stuffed cheetah, Speedy, which he'd had since he was 5. I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering how we'd gotten here. Wondering how many moments I'd swallowed over the years in the name of peace. Turns out, peace wasn't real. It was just silence bought by swallowing your pride. The next morning, I had a text from Ryan. Seriously, dude? That was petty. Real mature. If you had a problem with dinner, you could have said something. Instead, you pull that stunt. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I did say something. You just weren't listening. No reply after that. We drove back home in silence for most of the ride. Not an uncomfortable one, just a tired silence. Jacob kept looking out the window, face pressed to the glass. About halfway through the drive, he turned to me and asked, "Did I do something wrong?" I almost pulled the car over. "No," I said firmly. "Not even close." But Uncle Ryan looked mad. And Melanie didn't talk to me at all. And they didn't give me anything. "That's on them," I said. "Not you. You didn't do anything wrong." He nodded slowly, still unconvinced. That moment changed everything. The next few weeks were weird. I didn't hear from my parents. Not even a follow-up thank you for dinner. No, it was great seeing you. No, sorry about the misunderstanding. Just radio silence. It wasn't unusual for my mom to avoid conflict, but Dad's silence stung more than I expected. Ryan, on the other hand, took to Facebook like a passive-aggressive poet. 2 days after the dinner, he posted a long status about how some people just love to play the victim and use their kids to stir drama. He never named me, of course, but it was clear as day who it was aimed at. A few mutual relatives liked the post. One of them even commented, "Sad when jealousy gets in the way of family." Jealousy? That one actually made me laugh. Jealousy of what? His leased Tesla? His Instagrammable vacations? His kids who couldn't make eye contact without a screen in front of them? Still, I didn't respond. I didn't post. I didn't reach out. I just unplugged. Instead, I focused on Jacob. I started picking him up from school earlier when I could, just to give us time to talk. We started doing dad and detective nights, where we watched old mystery shows and tried to solve the crimes before the episode ended. We signed up for a weekend robotics class at the community center. I stopped saying, maybe later, and started saying, sure, let's try it. I also started writing again. Back in college, I used to love writing short stories, quiet little character pieces about ordinary people trying to make sense of the world. I hadn't touched a keyboard creatively in almost a decade. But one night, after Jacob had gone to bed, I sat down and opened a blank document. The words came pouring out. Not angry words. Not revenge fantasies. Just honesty. Reflections. I wrote about the dinner, the way Melanie smirked, the weight behind Jacob's empty plate, the silence of my parents. I wrote about what it felt like to realize your family was never really your family. It was raw and painful and somehow freeing. I started a blog under a pseudonym, just to put the word somewhere. No promotion, no ads. Just a quiet corner of the internet where I could untangle the knots I'd been carrying. And something strange happened. People started reading, commenting, reaching out. Apparently, I wasn't alone. Dozens, no, hundreds, of strangers began sharing their own stories. About being the forgotten sibling, the overlooked cousin, the one who always got the well, we thought you were fine on your own treatment. It became a lifeline. Not fame, not fortune, just connection. One woman messaged me to say she read my post while sitting in her car outside her brother's house, debating whether to knock on the door for Thanksgiving or just drive away. She drove away and felt better for it. Another man told me he printed one of my entries and gave it to his therapist, said it explained things better than he ever could. And me? I kept writing. At work, things started shifting too. I'd always played it safe, middle management, quiet in meetings, agreeable to a fault. But something had changed. I started speaking up more. Not aggressively, just confidently. I pitched a project I'd been sitting on for a year. My boss raised an eyebrow, said this is solid, and passed it up the chain. 3 weeks later, I was in charge of rolling it out. A modest promotion followed. Not life-changing, but validating. I wasn't invisible anymore. Not at work. Not at home. Not even online. The rise was slow, quiet, but steady. And yet, despite all that, the wound from that dinner still itched. Not because of the money. Not even because of Ryan. Because my parents never called. Not once. It had been almost 2 months. Then, on a random Thursday evening, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I ignored it. Then came the voicemail. It was my dad. Hey Mark, it's me. Just wanted to check in. Your mom's been well, she's been upset. Lot of tension lately. Ryan said you two had some kind of misunderstanding at dinner. Maybe we could all sit down sometime. Talk it through. Anyway, hope you're well. Tell Jacob we said hi. I didn't call back. Not right away. Instead, I walked into Jacob's room. He was sitting on the floor, trying to build a catapult out of popsicle sticks and rubber bands. Need help? I asked. He looked up, smiling. I think I almost got it. I sat down beside him. We spent the next hour testing designs and laughing at our failures. For the first time in a long time, I felt present. Whole. The next morning, I opened my inbox and found an email from Melanie. No greeting. Just one line. Ryan says you owe us $672.34. Please transfer it by Friday. That was the moment I realized something I hadn't let myself admit yet. They weren't just selfish. They were petty, vindictive, entitled to the core. And they weren't going to let this go. But neither was I. Because now, I wasn't just protecting myself. I was protecting Jacob. And they had no idea who they were messing with anymore. The email sat in my inbox like a rotten piece of fruit. I stared at it for a solid minute before clicking away. Not deleting it, just minimizing it, like that would somehow make it less real. Melanie's passive-aggressive masterpiece, demanding I reimburse them for a dinner they orchestrated, ordered, and controlled. Down to the last filet and gold-flake dessert. $672.34. Right down to the penny. As if she had been waiting for a reason. As if I had given her one. That number clanged around in my head for the rest of the day. Not because of the money. I could cover it. That wasn't the issue. It was the implication. The entitlement. The way she framed it like I was the problem. The nuisance. The barnacles stuck to their yacht. I waited 3 days before replying. Not because I was uncertain, but because I was planning. Thinking. Replaying every moment of that dinner in my head. Every smug smirk. Every empty plate. Every glance my son gave me when he realized he wasn't going to be treated like the other kids. I typed a one-line reply. You'll get your money when Jacob gets an apology. That was it. No response. But that's when I knew. I wasn't dealing with family anymore. I was dealing with people who saw themselves as a tier above me, who thought they could manipulate the narrative. And worse, they thought I wouldn't fight back. They didn't know who I was becoming. Over the next few weeks, something shifted in me. A kind of calm, calculated awareness. Like I'd finally woken up in a house I'd been sleepwalking through for decades. I went back to the blog, my anonymous little corner of the internet. I wrote a piece titled The Empty Plate, a story about family hierarchies. It wasn't just about the dinner. It was about how some families have unspoken rules, unspoken tiers, and how if you're not at the top, you're expected to stay quiet, be grateful, and bring your own crumbs. The post exploded. It got shared on Reddit, then picked up by a parenting site. Then it landed on a blog aggregator that pushed it out to newsletters. Within a week, it had over 150,000 views. The comments flooded in. Dozens of people saying things like, "This is my sister to a T. My mom made my kids sit on folding chairs in the garage while my brother's kids had the dining table." I cried reading this. I thought I was the only one. And that's when something clicked. I had leverage. Not just online. In real life. Because Ryan and Melanie, especially Melanie, cared about appearances. Their entire identity was built around the curated version of their life. The high-end photos, the generous gestures, the birthday gift bags that just happened to exclude the wrong person. So I started documenting. Every text, every email, every backhanded comment from Melanie, every petty jab from Ryan, every time they made Jacob feel small. I didn't post it yet. I just kept receipts. Because this wasn't about revenge by destruction. This was going to be revenge by exposure. By precision. I also started talking to people. Remember Rachel? My cousin from Dad's side? We hadn't spoken much in recent years. But she reached out after reading the blog. "I didn't know that was you," she said. "But I knew that was our family." We started catching up. Turns out, she had her own stories. About how Melanie had accidentally forgotten her daughter's name at a family party. How Ryan had dismissed her husband's job as glorified data entry. It wasn't just me. They had a pattern. And it was bigger than I realized. I asked her, carefully, if she'd ever noticed a divide growing in how our parents treated our side of the family versus Ryan's. She didn't hesitate. Always. And then she said something that stuck with me. "You've been the quiet one, Mark. But you're not invisible. They just got used to you not fighting back." That's when I made my decision. I wasn't going to argue with Ryan anymore. I wasn't going to chase an apology from Melanie. I was going to turn the entire power dynamic on its head. Step 1. Jacob's birthday. It was coming up in March. He was turning 11. Normally, I kept it small. His 2 closest friends, some pizza, maybe a movie night. But this time, I wanted him to feel seen. I rented out a space at the local science center. A huge room with interactive exhibits, robotics kits, and a staff-led demonstration involving liquid nitrogen. Every kid got a lab coat with their name embroidered on it. I worked with a local bakery to make a cake shaped like a spaceship, complete with edible fog. The whole thing was, no exaggeration, epic. And I didn't invite Ryan's family. Not out of spite, but because I knew what would happen if I did. Ryan would show up late. Melanie would bring some flashy gift meant to upstage everyone. And Olivia and Mason would sulk in the corner glued to their phones. Then Melanie would find a way to throw shade at the venue, the food, or the fact that Jacob was so into science. Instead, I invited the people who showed up for us. Jacob's teachers, my co-workers, Rachel and her daughter, a few other parents from Jacob's school who'd always been kind. It was the best party Jacob ever had. And for the first time in a long time, I saw my son walk into a room and feel like he belonged in it. That night, I got a text from Ryan. Saw the pics on Rachel's feed. "Nice party. Shame you didn't include family." I didn't reply. Instead, I posted a new blog entry. Sometimes, family is a circle you get to draw. It was gentle, reflective. I didn't name names. But I made it clear. If someone consistently makes your child feel unworthy, you don't owe them proximity. You owe your child protection. Another post that blew up. Another wave of strangers thanking me. More importantly, Jacob started asking questions. "Dad, how come we don't see Uncle Ryan anymore?" And I told him the truth. Not the whole adult version, but enough. Because not everyone treats us with kindness. And we don't spend time with people who make us feel small. He thought about that, then nodded. I like our new friends better anyway. So did I? The final piece of the setup came when I got a call from a podcast host, someone who ran a parenting podcast with a decent audience. They'd read my blog and wanted me to come on and talk about invisible family hierarchies. At first, I said no. I didn't want to put myself in the spotlight. But then I remembered Melanie's email. I remembered the birthday dinner. And I remembered the look in Jacob's eyes when he realized he wasn't worth a bracelet. So I said yes. We recorded it over Zoom. Just 40 minutes. I didn't use names, but I described the dinner. The empty plate. The "you should have packed snacks" comment. I talked about how subtle disrespect compounds over time. How quiet people eventually wake up. How setting boundaries doesn't make you petty. It makes you powerful. The episode aired 2 weeks later. Within 3 days, it had over 200,000 streams. And then the phone rang again. This time, it was my mother. She left a voicemail. "Mark, what is this podcast everyone's sending me? Did you really say all that? Ryan is furious. Melanie's threatening legal action. Please call me back. This is getting out of hand." But it wasn't. It was finally getting into my hands. They had built a system that only worked if I stayed silent. Now I had a voice, and they had no idea what was coming next. I listened to my mother's voicemail 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because I wanted to feel the weight of her words. Really feel it. The same way I had felt her silence after Jacob sat with an empty plate. The same way I had felt her looking the other way for most of my life. Ryan is furious. Melanie's threatening legal action. There it was. Not concern for what happened to Jacob. Not regret over what she and Dad had allowed to fester. Just panic. Panic over how the family looked. That was the thread that had always held us together. Appearance. Reputation. And now I had pulled on it hard enough that the whole illusion was unraveling. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. The podcast had gone viral in a way none of us expected. The host messaged me the day after it aired and said, "Dude, I think you struck a nerve with the entire internet." A clip of me describing Jacob's empty plate was turned into a TikTok. Then another. Then a Twitter thread. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about the thousands of people who had sat in the same silence I had, smiling through dinners, being polite while their kids were excluded, swallowing shame so thick it stuck for years. I hadn't intended to start a movement. But somehow I had. Melanie's response came 3 days later. A formal letter, sent to my personal email and work address, drafted by a lawyer whose letterhead screamed empty threats in serif font. The language was precise, polished, and utterly hollow. The recent podcast contains identifiable references to our clients that have caused reputational damage. We are requesting that all mentions be removed and that you cease and desist further commentary. They didn't have a case. I had used no names. I hadn't defamed anyone. I had told a story, a true one, and protected identities. But the irony? They outed themselves. I forwarded the email to the podcast host. He laughed and said, "Classic. Want to do a follow-up episode?" I told him I had a better idea. It was time to close the loop. Jacob and I were in the car on the way to a science fair when the real revenge began. I asked him, casually, "Hey, if you could do anything for a summer project, like anything, what would it be?" He thought about it for a second. "Build my own drone. Like one that can actually fly and take pictures." I nodded. "Okay, let's do it." That weekend, I reached out to a few people I'd met through the blog, engineers, makers, even a retired NASA tech who lived just one state over. I asked if they'd be interested in mentoring a small group of kids on science projects. Not for profit, just to pay it forward. Within a week, we had 6 kids, 3 volunteer mentors, and a free room at the local library every Saturday. We called it the Young Inventors Club. I didn't invite Olivia or Mason. Didn't even tell Ryan. But Rachel's daughter joined. So did a kid from Jacob's school who had never been invited to a single birthday party because he was too intense. So did another boy whose dad had left recently and who had started acting out at school. Every week, we built something. A soda bottle rocket, a solar oven, a robotic hand made from cardboard and string. And every week, Jacob stood a little taller, spoke a little louder, laughed a little freer. And me? I wrote it all down. Every project, every breakthrough, every small triumph that proved to me that family isn't who you're born with. It's who shows up. Meanwhile, Ryan and Melanie's carefully curated world started to crack. It began online. A momfluencer posted a reaction video to my podcast clip titled, "Who TF says you should have packed snacks to a kid?" The comments exploded. Melanie energy. Imagine treating your nephew like a stray. Deadbeat aunt and uncle vibes. People didn't know it was her, of course. But Melanie did. And Ryan did. And based on the growing number of mutual friends who had stopped liking their Instagram posts, I think a lot of people figured it out. Then came the real fallout. A mutual friend, Brandon, called me out of the blue. I probably shouldn't be saying this, he said. But Ryan's been going around telling people you're unstable, that you're obsessed with him, that the podcast thing was a cry for help. I let him talk. Then I asked, and do you believe him? There was a pause. No. Honestly, I've known you 20 years, man. You've always been solid. And I've seen how Melanie talks to people. She's just more subtle about it. That was the moment I realized they were losing their grip. Not just on me, but on the whole narrative. They had spent years positioning themselves as the successful, generous power couple. Now they were exposed. Not by scandal. Not by rage. By the truth. Simple, quiet, undeniable truth. And that was when I decided to finish it. My father reached out again. This time in person. He drove down, something he hadn't done in over 5 years, and knocked on my door unannounced. I opened it to see him standing there with a Tupperware of my mom's lemon bars. The universal symbol of apology in our family. Got a minute? I let him in. Jacob was at a sleepover. The house was quiet. We sat in the kitchen. He didn't touch his coffee. After a long pause, he said, I didn't realize it was that bad. I didn't respond. He tried again. I thought you didn't mind. You were always the quiet one. I nodded slowly. Exactly. He sighed. Your brother's a good kid, Mark. He just... No, I said firmly. He's not a kid. And he's not a good person. Not to me. Not to my son. He looked down, as if he'd never considered that before. I continued. I'm not asking you to choose sides. I'm asking you to stop pretending there aren't sides at all. Another pause. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, Your mother's ashamed. Of me? No, he said quickly. Of herself. Of us. For not seeing it. That landed heavier than I expected. Not because I needed the validation, but because it meant the story had finally reached their house. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. I frowned. What's that? A check, he said. For Jacob. College fund. From both of us. I didn't take it. Not then. But I looked him in the eye and said, if you want to be part of his life, it starts with showing up. No more lemon bars. No more pretending. He nodded. And for once, he didn't argue. 3 weeks later, I published my final blog post. It wasn't about Ryan. It wasn't even about the dinner. It was about legacy. About what we pass down to our children. How silence becomes shame. How favoritism becomes generational trauma. How standing up, even if it's late, is still better than never doing it at all. I ended it with a photo. Jacob standing in front of the science fair exhibit he built with his own hands. A fully functional drone with a 3D printed frame and a camera that streamed live footage. He named it the Lookout. In the caption, I wrote, he doesn't need gold bracelets. He built his own wings. I never sent Melanie the $672.34. But I did send her a copy of the Lookout's patent application. Jacob's idea had gotten picked up by a youth innovation grant. He was 12. She never replied. As for Ryan, he sent one more text. Hope you're happy. You destroyed the family. To which I responded, no, I finally protected mine. We haven't spoken since. And honestly, it's been peaceful. The kind of peace that doesn't require silence. The kind you earn. The kind you build. The kind you fight for. And now, every time I look at Jacob, confident, curious, unafraid, I know exactly when the change happened. It wasn't at the science fair, or the birthday party, or even on that podcast. It was at a steakhouse in Chicago, when he sat with an empty plate. And I finally said, good to know.